Good evening, welcome. I'm John. I'm a bookseller at Literati Bookstore in downtown Ann Arbor, Michigan. We're so pleased to welcome Jem Calder and Rebecca Miller in support of their new story collections and in conversation this evening with Jessie Gaynor. Just a quick webinar overview for our attendees. For those of you who are just joining us, the chat is closed this evening, but we encourage you to keep the chat window open. I'll be sharing links to purchase the book from Literati and our other participating bookstores this evening, Community Bookstore and Books and Books. And the Q&A is available to you to use at any time. Please feel free to submit your questions whenever they come to you, and I'll ask a selection of your questions at the conclusion of the conversation this evening. And live transcription is available to you on your toolbar as well. And if you're watching us later on YouTube, there are always links to purchase books in the description directly below me. Or you can also subscribe using, there's a little typewriter button on your screen here too. And if you click on that, you'll be kept up to date with all of our At Home with Literati events once they become available on our channel. And as a reminder, you can shop for more books from Literati Bookstore at literatibookstore.com. I'll also be sharing links to purchase books from our other participating bookstores this evening, the Great Community Bookstore in Brooklyn and Books and Books in Miami, two of my favorite bookstores on planet Earth. And we're so happy to have them join us in presenting this event this evening. But if you're in Southeast Michigan or in the Ann Arbor area, Literati Bookstore is open to the public for in-store shopping as well. We'd love to see you. But most of all, on behalf of FSG, on behalf of Books and Books, on behalf of community, we'd just like to thank you for your attendance this evening or this morning or later this afternoon, much later this evening in Jem's case, depending on where and when in the world you may be joining us. So without further ado, I'll introduce tonight's author and our moderator, and then turn it over to a special guest to begin. Rebecca Miller is the author of the short story collection, Personal Velocity, her feature film adaptation of which won the Grand Jury Prize at Sundance, and the novels The Private Lives of Pippa Lee, which she also adapted for the screen, and Jacob's Folly. Her other films include Angela, The Ballad of Jack and Rose, and Maggie's Plan. She lives in New York with her family. Jem Calder was born in Cambridge and lives and works in London. His first two completed stories were published in The Stinging Fly and Granta. After reading, they'll be speaking with Jessie Gaynor, who's a senior editor at LitHub, whose writing has appeared in McSweeney's, The New Yorker, The Paris Review, and elsewhere. Her first novel, The Glow, is forthcoming from Random House. But to kick things off tonight, please join me in welcoming Mitzi Angel, president and publisher at FSG.
Thank you. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. Thank you, John. And congratulations to Rebecca and Jem. We published their story collections this month. And the short story is really very special to us at FSG. And we're very, very proud to have such accomplished writers in our midst. Rebecca's book, Total, is about mesmerizing characters living alongside catastrophe, I would say. Personal, global, political, real, imagined. An amazing review in the New York Review, in the New York Times today. You've never quite seen stories inhabited by these versions of these characters, nor at the tenor of these sentences, with these deftly deployed layers of surprise. So congratulations, Rebecca. It's wonderful. And Jem, I remember reading your book when it came in to FSG. Eric very excitedly handed over the manuscript to me. Reward system is about mostly young people waiting for real life to begin, swiping, dieting, writing, yearning for intimacy and sometimes finding it. And this is another quote from another newspaper, from The Guardian. Calder is a superb writer, funny, graceful, acidly cynical, lyrical, and always verbally dexterous and inventive. He can make the boredom of office life fascinating. He can make a desolate house party enlivening. So I know that the conversation is going to be enlivening. Jem is going to start by reading from his book, and Jessie Gaynor, senior editor at LitHub, is going to be moderating the conversation once we've heard readings from both Jem and Rebecca. I really look forward to listening to this. Thank you so much to the bookstores as well. We're so happy to partner with you.
Amazing. Hi, I'm Jem. I'm reading from my book, Reward System. This story is called Distraction from Sadness is Not the Same Thing as Happiness. I will be setting a timer, so I stick to 5 minutes because I can't really keep track of time while I'm reading. And it's about dating apps. The algorithm took into consideration the common interests, venning friendships, and left-to-right swipe ratio categorized attractiveness brackets of the two users before providing each with the other's profile card for approval. At 19:15 BST, which by now the algorithm had determined to be her peak time of app usage, the female user sat in one of the give-up seats at the front of a single-deck city bus and, via the interface of her smartphone's algorithm-based dating app, encountered the male user's profile card for the first time. Upon seeing his profile card, which, like the rigidly customizable profile cards of the algorithm-based dating app's other non-premium users, consisted starkly of a forename and age-bearing header, a scrollable gallery of 6 500 by 500 pixel square images, and below that, a geographical location marker plus maximum 5 lines of introductory sans serif text. The female user close to instantly registered that the male user was the exact type of guy she and the algorithm would classify as her type. The algorithm took note of the haste with which the female user scrolled through, then back a second time through the pictures of the male user, the celerity with which she accordingly swiped right on his profile card, constituting, by a comfortable margin, a record decision-making time for a user otherwise grouped into the algorithm's upper 80th percentile for choosiness. After presenting to the female user a rendering of the word like being stamped diagonally across the male user's forehead, the algorithm dissolved his profile card from the dating app's main display and generated a full-screen dynamic ad intended to appeal to the female user by promoting a product relevant to her known wants and spending behaviors. In the case of the female user specifically, said product was a cosmetic cream manufactured to tighten loose or flabby skin below the mandible. Midway through the ad's 18-second playtime, the female user clicked her smartphone locked and stared out of the nearest bus window. Whether or not she absently ran the backs of her fingers over the soft underside of her chin as she watched the passing world and considered her place in it, the algorithm could not say. The male user, supine, abed, and whose peak time of app usage was occurring now, some 6 hours later than that of the female user, came across her profile card mid-deck, roughly 30 profile cards deep into his late-night swiping binge. The algorithm arranged these encounters strategically, needling a user's most statistically likely matches into the dense haystacks of their least statistically likely matches in order to prolong the stretches of unbroken habit-forming in-app time spent by its users. As the male user observed the female user's profile, so too did the algorithm observe him, surveilled the way he, predictably, paused longest on her lone bikini pic, while cycling through the cloud-stored images retrieved from the algorithm-based dating app's central image database, whose actual physical servers were located 4,000 plus transatlantic miles from the male and female users' city of mutual residence. The male user concentrated long enough on the image of the female user to begin feeling confined by it. In full knowledge of the enterprise's probable futility, but without anything else to do before he slept, the male user conducted a few cursory social media and professional networking site searches of the female user's first name, followed by select speech-marked keywords relating to her profession and alma mater, copied from her bio, the only available clues as to her identity, none of which yielded any relevant results. Then he thumbed back to the algorithm-based dating app's main interface and swiped right on the female user's profile. That swipe prompted the cursive style words, "It's a match," to appear in the center of the male user's smartphone, while simultaneously, 2 circles, each containing one of the 2 users' main profile images, rolled to a halt mid-screen beneath the bannered text. A combination of words and images which always, without fail, prompted the male user to involuntarily hear the Looney Tunes, "That's all folks" closing theme reverberating from some back room inside his head. Having received the gut-situated upsurge of jackpot-style gratification that attaining a new match still provided him, the male user sat up a little on his single extra-sized mattress. Hoping to use the satiated feeling of having reached a desired outcome with little to no effort as a kind of emotional force field through which to venture into emotional territories ordinarily too painful for him to brave, the male user circled back through his most recently used apps and, via his smartphone's web browser, revisited one of the social media sites on which he'd just attempted to identify the female user. The male user proceeded to type the full name of his most recent long-term sexual partner into the social media site's top-level search bar and, finding her there, monitored the activity displayed on her personal feed. He scanned through a few new tagged photos in which she looked like she'd put on weight, combed the names of certain profiles she'd recently interacted with, skim-read a fundraising page for a child specialist medical bills. Still revolving the idea of his most recent long-term sexual partner in his head, the male user navigated to his go-to pornography site and masturbated for 6 minutes while watching a pornographic video on mute. He masturbated neither to the pornography itself nor to the thoughts of his most recent long-term sexual partner, but instead to an imagined holographic-seeming emulsion of the two separate stimuli. His most recent long-term sexual partner's face overlaying the porn actress's body, then the porn actress's face overlaying his most recent long-term sexual partner's body. It felt relaxing and automatic to do this. Afterward, he speculated about how depressing he must look to the walls, to God, to the algorithm, to any of his deceased family members if they were watching him the way he imagined them, crystal ball style from the bright white halls of the afterlife. Although the algorithm knew exactly how the male user frittered his time, it was incapable of passing judgment on him. It reassured the male user to remind himself that none of this software had any vested interest in him personally, that it basically only existed to furnish him with ads. Thank you very much for letting me read. Cheers.
Thank you, Jem. And now we'll hear from Rebecca Miller.
So this story begins with Jode and Andrew walking up a long driveway toward a big river house, which they've been invited to just in time for sunset at 7 o'clock. And yeah, so I'm just going to jump in sort of a few paragraph later. Their steps crunched the pebbles of the long drive as the river house drew nearer, an imposing square mansion painted dove gray with scarlet shutters. They had been told to walk around the side to the porch. As they complied, they saw, like a carved figure at the prow of a great ship, a statuesque woman gazing down at them, the ripples of her long white dress seemingly frozen in place, a bright orange cocktail glowing in her hand. "At last," exclaimed Colleen Prentice in a shredded voice. She opened one powerful arm as if to hug the air, clinking the ice in her drink. Mounting the steps to the colonnaded porch ahead of Andrew, Joe took the woman in. Around 70, she was beautiful, golden, with a broad, beaming face that exuded privilege and goodwill. Colleen shook both their hands and ushered them onto the porch, emanating an aggressive, spicy scent that made Joe's throat constrict. "I've been dying to meet you two for ages, but Trevor has been keeping you to himself," she declared. Trevor Prentice, Colleen's son, had sold Jode and Andrew a dilapidated 1920s farmhouse on 3 acres of land for under market value a year earlier. The stubborn colony of raccoons that resided in the long, empty house accounted for the low price, they assumed. They chased off the animals, sealed up the gaps in the walls and floorboards, and scrubbed every surface with bleach. But only a week ago, Jode had glanced out the kitchen window after midnight to see 3 of the wily creatures, hands up on a sill, peering in at her with what she took to be curiosity and longing. Jode and Andrew took their front row seats on the grand porch and gaped at the Hudson River Valley sunset, which spread its legs with lurid abandon, revealing electric blue mountains etched into the rosy sky, creamsicle orange clouds floating like torn cotton puffs, and the river glowing fuchsia, the colors changing and intensifying by the instant. Jode's gaze slipped along the glowing hills, panning left to follow the now purple current, and landed in a startling close-up of Colleen, 2 feet away, scrutinizing her greedily. What combination of genes could have created that spectacular face? Colleen wondered out loud. "Sorry, I'm curious about your ancestry. I've been thinking Eskimo, Gypsy, Mongolian." "Oh," said Jode, "I'm Chinese, Irish, Native American." "Tell me how that happened," said Colleen with an expectant stare. "Oh, my great-great-grandfather came from Canton province to work on the railroads in California, and he met my great-great-grandmother, who we think was Shumash, and then it was kind of a big mix from there on in, but mostly Chinese and Irish." A great face, pronounced Colleen, taking a sip of her drink. And then, turning to Andrew with a perfunctory smile, she asked, and you? Scotch-Irish. I find it fascinating, said Colleen, turning from Andrew back to Jode, where people originate. I'm Huguenot and Viking and Welsh, if pressed. Just then, Trevor Prentice emerged from inside the house. His graying blonde hair curled around his head in Roman style, and he wore a benevolent expression, his head cocked, hands clasped against his narrow chest like a middle-aged elf. And Trevor's father added Sephardic to that mix, Colleen concluded. Talking bloodlines, asked Trevor, his voice head set high up in the belfry of his nose. You two tell Trevor what you would like to drink, Colleen said. Choose anything you like. As he may have told you, Trevor is a restaurateur, she added dryly. We're easy, said Andrew, whatever you're having. Negronis, then, said Colleen, draining her glass and shaking it at her son, who collected it and disappeared inside. Just then, a very large, white, wet dog exploded up the stairs and onto the porch. Hysterically enthusiastic, he bounded in circles, releasing high-pitched shrieks and an arc of cold river water, anointing the guests, then threw his paws up on his mistress in a climax of devotion. Chet, scolded Colleen, attempting to wipe a muddy paw print from her breast. Oh, Christ, here. She snapped her fingers, and the dog promptly lay on its back. Then Colleen leaned over, grabbed his furry cock, and proceeded to masturbate the animal matter-of-factly as she resumed the conversation, craning her neck to look up at Andrew and Jode and inquiring, Where were you living before you came here? Andrew, frozen, his eyes glued to her face, compulsively listed their history backward, renting a few acres of farmland further upstate, before that the collective homestead in Oregon, and in their early 20s, the blur of life on the road, living paycheck to paycheck with no fixed abode, working boats and ski resorts, whatever they could find. Jode sat mute, trying to recall if she'd ever heard Andrew speak so much to a stranger. Trevor entered with the drinks on a battered silver tray and shook his head at his mother, smiling indulgently as he handed them their cocktails. Mom's at it again, said Trevor. It's the only thing that calms him down, Colleen explained, her arm jiggling mechanically as the dog's eyes glazed over. How's everything going with the house? Asked Trevor. We're getting there, said Andrew. Trevor bought that place as something to fix up and flip, said Colleen. Pardon my vulgarity. But when I heard a nice young couple wanted to run an organic farm on the land, I told Trevor to sell it to you as is for exactly what he paid. Damn the profits. The dog flopped over to his side, seemingly unconscious.
Thank you, Rebecca. And now we will have a conversation with both authors, moderated by Jessie Gaynor.
Hello. Thank you both so much for reading and for writing such wonderful books. I enjoyed reading both of them so much. And I can't believe you both read scenes with such amazing and unexpected masturbation scenes in them. What a treat. I would love to start off just with a basic question, asking you guys to talk a little bit about how these collections came to be. And in the interest of not too much talking over each other, I will just ask Jem to go first.
Sure, yeah. Well, hi, Jessie. Nice to chat to you. Yeah, I really kind of came out of desperation, to be honest with you, because I was working a day job as a copywriter. I kind of like vaguely felt I had a literary sensibility, but the way that probably like most like deluded non-writers think that they have literary sensibility. So I kind of wasn't really working on that very hard. And then, yeah, just through like sheer feeling like I'd like completely lost my personality through my day job, I guess I started like trying to work on some stories, and none of them were very good. And then about like 4 years passed, and I suddenly had one that I thought was pretty good. And I sent that into a magazine, and that got published, and obviously a huge tidal wave of validation. And then that all recedes when you realize that like no one has read the magazine. No, that's not true, but it did, yeah, I carried on from that. And yeah, but in terms of making the collection a sort of cohesive, like finished piece of work, yeah, it really just came out of that first story. And like, I don't know, it's a bit of a cliche, I suppose, but writing the book you want to read, I guess. Like I felt like there were certain interesting things not necessarily going on in my life, but going on in other people's lives, and sort of like general larger thematic shifts that were happening or possibly not happening, this weird stasis that I think a lot of people like who are in their like mid to late 20s and living in a major city feel. And yeah, I don't know, that felt like good like fodder for stories, I suppose. And then yeah, inevitably I kind of just really started enjoying the characters I was writing about, and so the structure of the collection ended up being interlinked short stories with a sort of like overarching narrative, which wasn't really something I'd set out to do at the start, but I think it served it pretty well. And yeah, that was pretty much it.
Great. Becca?
So yeah, this collection, I guess sort of, I completed the first story in this collection about 20 years ago when I had just had my youngest child. And I was, so that was Mrs. Covet, and all the concerns in Mrs. Covet were my concerns, and sort of, what I was thinking about in terms of maternal paranoia and guilt, and also enjoyment, and kind of like everything that brings with it. And so, but then some of the stories, as I was writing, I wrote these I was doing other work. I was also writing a novel, and I was writing, making films. And so it was like the stories were almost like I was having an affair with my stories. It was like this very kind of very intimate secret thing that I was doing. And I did publish some of them over the time, but not all of them. And I didn't manage to figure out how to write some of the stories. So certain stories like Vapors or Total or Receipts were stories that I had started even earlier than 20 years ago, but I didn't know how to clothe these ideas in a story. I didn't know how to make it like a story. I just knew that there was an event or an idea or a scene or a feeling. And it was like, how do I do this? And so in a way, I kind of like, it was this story is particular in the sense, in some ways, it's like a bridge between who I am now and who I was, not only when I started the collection, but even earlier than that, like in my late 20s. So it's a kind of like it's a bit of a kaleidoscope. And I think my approach with the stories was quite that they have a kind of a kaleidoscopic quality, like they kind of are compressed, but they have often big time spans that they're dealing with. So I was also really interested in collapsing time. So it took a long time, but it was a really joyous thing because there was no expectation attached to it.
So both of you were, for these projects, really specifically interested in the short story form, I guess. And obviously they're short story collections, but it sounded like the short stories were calling you in one way or another. And Jem, I'm curious as to when you sort of started thinking about the character, when the characters were continuing to pull you back. Nick and Julia, I know, were sort of the characters who most of these stories orbit. What was it that said linked collection to you and not novel?
Well, it's like a really rubbish, like prosaic answer, but the sheer fact of like how I could manage my time around working was like a consideration early on. And yeah, I suppose, and also that it's a way of kind of like, for me, I was kind of able to like sideways my way into the task, right? If I'd have told myself like I've got to write a novel, that's like a huge commitment with like a very long lifespan, and like I might struggle to see that through, I mean, because one of the things about this collection is it's literally everything I've finished. Like any other story I've written before that wasn't finished, so I didn't go it. So like this is like my body of work right now is literally in this one book. So it was kind of a case of like wanting a place to house everything and like being able to get everything specifically in there. But yeah, I don't know. I feel like also that I suppose part of like finding my voice, being in this sort of like early stage of my career, or possibly the entirety of my career, depending on how this book sells, it was like I wanted a few different opportunities to try different voices, right? So and I noticed that like some of these stories I wrote earlier, like the one I read from just now, that has this very kind of like technical, almost like depressive mechanical register. And towards the end of working on the book, I was really trying to get out of that and write something a bit more sort of like, I don't know, where the dialogue is a bit sing-songy and like things can kind of like fizz a bit more and there can be a bit of excitement. I'm kicking myself for not reading one of those stories at the start of this thing instead of the really depressing robot voice one. But yeah, it was a good opportunity to like really mess around with some different ideas. And then in terms of being sucked back into those characters, I don't know, that there was an element of it where I started another story and was just going to have, essentially like the main characters. I mean, a lot of what they're going through is like sort of a cipher of like what I'm, experiences I've had. And like, a lot of the main issues the characters are facing are things that I've confronted in my own life. And it just sort of started to feel a bit delusional to be like, well, I'm writing all these similar stories, but this is Nick, and then this is John, and this is Julia, and this is Joanne. It's like I just kind of decided to do away with that artifice and kind of have something, just allow the things to overarch. And I wanted it to have this sort of like resolution, which is cool, because then Rebecca's book, your stories do like in a really pleasing way, they feel very like separate and whole, there is no need for them to sort of like, although like certain themes and like images recur throughout the collection, they're like really pleasingly kind of separate, and they all like escalate in a separate way and like feature a separate exciting event. And yeah, it makes it a really enjoyable read.
I was just thinking how cool it is to do an interweaving. I mean, how much I would love one day to do something like that with interweaving stories. I think that's really great. And I think, and also I have to say, I really admire the way that you write female character. I think that that's really unusual for a male writer to be able to write that way about, a female in such a believable way. For me, the excitement of this collection was exactly that they were all these different people. I'm kind of greedy for character. I'm obsessed with characters, and I have a kind of, I want to gobble them all up, like when I stare at people. Yeah. I just want to eat the whole world. And so in a way, like, this is me, like, sort of, that's a piece of that, it's just like being fascinated by human beings, and a kind of like, I don't know, just wanting to express that fascination and how infinitely interesting people are. And I guess that's what it really boils down to, is my fascination with character, like beyond anything else, I guess. And this short story form, though, I think that's great, unlike novels, is that it's very anarchic. Like it can be anything. You can end a short story in the middle of a sentence. You can end a short story like just as you're about to say something else. Like, Raymond Carver is kind of like the king of that. But that sort of like, just they have to lift off at the end somehow. Like, it's a kind of like, they're sort of metaphysical almost, I feel like, short stories. Unlike the novel, which is a sort of, the chickens have to come home to roost at the end. You kind of have a responsibility. You've led someone for such a long time, and so it's in a way a more, I don't know, I think of it almost like as a more adult medium, and which doesn't mean you have to be older to write a novel. It doesn't have to do with how old the writer is. It's to do with a mindset. It's like, And I guess because I had this like a little bit like illicit feeling about the short stories, in the sense that I was writing them with, when I had a lot of other responsibilities, it's sort of that anarchy kind of was suitable to it, like unlike a novel, which is like Jem said, it's a huge undertaking, and it takes an enormous unit of concentration.
Yeah. What that made me think of your story, the one She Came to Me.
Yeah.
That one is like the perfect length. It almost plays like a joke. It's like it just ends at like it's like all in one day, this kind of like hilarious and like horrific experience, and it just ends with like a literal punchline. It's so good. Like that is like such a great compressed work. Like that yeah, the story is sorry, I'm getting some weird feedback. Can anyone else hear that? Sorry to Oh, okay.
Maybe no, it is.
Well, I'd also reached the end of my point. I'm sorry.
No, Rebecca, you talk about being greedy for characters. The characters in this collection are so memorable, and also just the so many of them contain just an incredible twist that I don't know that I've ever read a twist like this. It doesn't feel. None of them were twists that I saw coming, and I wonder if did you know what was going to happen to these characters when you started writing?
No, well, no. Usually I write into the dark, and then I kind of like see something looming in the distance, and I'm like, oh, I see that, and I'm going to write toward it, like I see it, and then but I kind of, it's like, I find it's almost like I want them, it isn't really like the characters are telling me what the story is, because that's sort of false, because of course I am writing, but it's like I do try to stay inside of it. And then of course there's the moment where you go outside and then you're constructing and you're the mechanic under the hood and stuff. But in terms of like, for example, I Want You to Know, which is the story that I just read from, and which there's that twist. It's a kind of like the most Poe, like Edgar Allan Poe, like, type of story. I didn't know the answer. Like, I didn't know. I had written the part about the letter that she finds inside the drawer. I had written that like 10 years ago, and I didn't know what to do with the letter. I was like, I didn't know what it was. I thought maybe it was a story. I was trying to write it as a story for such a long time. And then I remembered this thing of like, I think I forget what book by Kierkegaard, where he finds a manuscript in a drawer. And so I thought, it's so cool, the idea that you find something in it. And the idea also of like how an object, it could be like possessed by something. And so that's how it sort of, but then it wasn't until like the conversation with Colleen was happening, I was like, oh my God, that's the answer. So yeah, so.
It's, I just love that so much. I would love to talk a little bit about something that you both touched on a little bit when you were discussing the process of writing. Something that I felt, for me, unified these two books was just this sort of underlying thrumming doom really that sort of coexisted with the other concerns of a life. But Jen, the story, A Restaurant Somewhere, begins with this, I have the line here, at the beginning of a December 57 harvest prior to the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations projected start date, the era of total global soil infertility, Julia got a job at Cachenet. Am I saying that right?
I'm not going to say how I pronounce it because I'm probably wrong and you're probably right. So you say that. That sounds good to me.
No, but I mean, that is obviously a kind of doom that we're all living with, obviously, at the moment. But I feel like that sentence, it really sets up this idea of we are living our lives amid doom. And Rebecca, in Mrs. Covet, there's a similar sort of, it starts with there's a beginning of a literal plague of ladybugs, and then there's sort of this life happening, and then there's, a parental nightmare. So I guess it was the idea of ambient dread something that you were thinking about as you wrote, or is that just in the air? Am I just thinking about that constantly and I'm projecting it on your books?
Yeah, I definitely, I really wanted it to be like this sort of like background ambient level dread, which I think is how a lot of us experience this current, like the things we've been going through for maybe the last decade. Yeah, there's a part in the book also where someone kind of like misremembers a bunch of vaguely like apocalyptic facts and just kind of like monologues them at someone else who's like not really listening, like, because we kind of have to occupy this weird space where we all have to acknowledge like there is a great, very grave like potential future ahead of us. But then the fundamental thing is it's like part of what makes it so horrifying is it's grounded in banality, right? Because we can't really, effectively as individuals live for 50 years from now. Like there really isn't a lot we can do. So what we do is like go to work and like eat meals, just like the same old stuff. And it kind of, things just kind of linger in the background in this weird way. So I think because I wanted that sentence you read, that's the first sentence of the book. And I kind of did want that there to almost obnoxiously kind of like wave the hand in your face of like, oh yeah, there is this like horrible thing, and then just kind of ignore it and kind of like carry on and tell a kind of like weird love story. That felt good to me. But yeah, I'd be really interested to hear what Rebecca has to say, because I experienced so much dread reading so many of your stories, but so many of them had this middle point. I think that one total for me was like this. It just absolutely killed me. But like the just gradual escalation of like dread in that was so cool, and similarly like, but also having it grounded in this sort of like weird relationship with technology in this like super kind of depressing, sad way is something I'm really interested in. But yeah, I'd really love to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, well, I think, it's so interesting because I definitely got that feeling very deeply from your work as well. Like, but also you sort of the beauty of that people are still worried about their identities and whether or not they're being honest about themselves or to themselves. Like, life goes on. For me, I think I work very unconsciously in that way. And so because so much of myself is in these stories, and I don't mean necessarily like, autobiographically in a strict sense, but my deep preoccupations, which is probably sounds like it's similar to you, but it all just comes out like my, that sense of dread, of doom, of like, but at the same time of hopefulness despite that. Like, but I think that, that it's very human. I mean, like the Aztecs thought that the world was going to end, that sort of sense that the end is coming is so deeply human. And it's sort of like, in the times of the plague and the Middle Ages, and it's not that doesn't make our situation even more serious because it's actually going to happen, but at the same time I think there's something about being human that contains that dread and knowing that death is coming, and then also like how stubborn life is and how stubborn romance is, and all the concerns of being a person. And I think of myself as a very kind of cheerful person, but I think that secretly I must be not so cheerful. But,
yeah. The short stories tell the truth. Wanted to get back to something that either Jem or Rebecca said, technology. Obviously, this is Total is a story that is very is precipitated by this sort of the way that technology sort of has warped love and desire in in the way that in sort of like a physical manifestation, that it created this irresistible connection between two people. The total phone, for people who haven't read, it was a piece of technology that dissolved the barrier between two people, created just pure bliss. But also, if someone was pregnant while using the total phone, it created a unique and debilitating birth defect. And then slightly less dramatically, more true to our contemporary lives, Jem, technology and desire have sort of, you also, I think, convey the way that desire is a little bit like refracted or warped by technology. And I wonder if you could both talk a bit about how you were thinking about technology as you wrote these stories, and what you think that you wanted to say about technology and humanity. I'll say Rebecca this time.
I think that for me, I guess the total phone, for me, I think that the thing that is so irresistible about technology is mostly, especially things like phones, and is that we want to connect. We don't want to be alone. And I think it comes down to, but yet ironically, it's making us more and more isolated. But I do think it comes from a very deep infantile desire to connect. And that's why, like people like make it like liken it to like breastfeeding, or, something where you're just utterly connected to another person, so that you just are, you just melt away. And how deeply it's sort of like before the fall of man, when Adam and Eve were just like in bliss. And so I sort of thought of that's what made the phone so irresistible, but then of course also so toxic, because you can't have paradise back. That's over. And when you try to get it back, terrible things happen. And in a way, the story is as much about a mother and a daughter, and about how and the dynamics of that, and how you can think you're doing something really good, and then you find out that you were actually doing it for this horrible, horrible reason, and that how life can trick you that way,
Yeah, I love the way in that story, I think you say one of the things that total phone does is jiggle around the electrons in people's brains. I thought that was so good. And I really like also, there's like a couple of like throwaway lines. Like I think the reason why I love that story so much, by the way, sorry, this isn't really answering the question. This is just me fanning out, but I really love the way you establish the technology and then kind of put the technology in the past, and you're dealing like this is kind of already an obsolescent technology that we've already moved from, and we're living in the aftermath of it. I thought that was such a great choice. I thought that works so well. And there's also the thing somewhere else where someone who works in this care facility says to the main character, there's a study that shows that like children born with a total birth defect, if they're not bored, they live longer or something like that. But I really love the idea of like bored, like that is very linked to the way I think about technology now as well, is it's the weird boredom feeling. It's the idea that like there's something in the back of your head that is just like nagging at you when everything around you is, silent. So you just have to like lapse back into this like weird tangent reality that happens on screen. And yeah, it's such a good question to ask, because there's like a kind of limitless possibility. I'm aware that some people probably like find the whole technology question super boring, but to me it's like the most fascinating thing like going on right now, because an experience I've had a few times with my own book is like there's a line in my book somewhere, sorry to quote my own work, that feels pretty gauche, but we're talking about it. So there's a part where like I think a character is like reading an email on his laptop, and then kind of like absently walks away to like get a break from his work. And then before he knows it, he's reading the exact same email on his phone. And I remember writing that like a couple of years ago. And then I did it again the other day. And it's like all these things, there's so many like little things in my work that I feel like I've like tried to sound out and like tried to reckon with and sort of like finally, you know, like put the pin on that and like articulate that thought perfectly. But that's the thing about technology. It's so circular and it's so seductive. And there's no, you know, like circular in as much as like you put the phone in your pocket, but like literally 20 seconds later, it's like a completely absent gesture, like to retrieve it. So I think there's something about that, like how it's like on the edge of, it's like pure absent-minded, foggy thinking desire that is just like so fascinating to me. And that like everyone, yeah, we've all kind of like swallowed the pill and we're just, yeah, like in the total story, like just living in this like weird aftermath. But yeah, no, I love thinking about it.
I also just will add that I think that one of the things that's really so interesting about your book is that how it asks the question of like, how are we changing as human beings? Like, and are we changing as human beings?
Yeah. Horrifically so.
I that moment with the email was haunting. I did not like reading something so true to my experience. I think we may be at the time where we're going to be opening it up to Q&A. John, Phil.
Yeah, we do have some questions. If you have questions and you're watching, you can feel free to submit them using the Q&A, and I will ask them on your behalf. Our first question is for Jem. Can you talk about sequencing the collection? Did you write the stories in the order that they appear here? Because they do seem to build upon each other.
Yeah, I didn't actually. Sorry, is my mic on? Yes. I didn't actually write them in that sequence. I'm trying to think. And also I did everything I could to not put the beginning story, because it's a long story and it's broken down into these little sections that have sort of subheadings. And I did everything I could to not put that story at the beginning, because it's a bit of it kind of potentially like filters some people out, you know, like to have this sort of like weird structural thing at the beginning. But then obviously I just thought, oh, the hell with it. It's really good. And I'll put it at the start. But, you know, and also like it does, yeah, the sequencing really fell into place towards the end of the writing process, I suppose. And the last story as well, which is kind of set like in vaguely COVID lockdown reality. I also wrote like so I had a very clear idea of how it was going to end before the last story I wrote was that one that's set in an office, the big one that's I think about halfway through the collection. So you know, it was really all over the place, and there was I'm not ashamed to admit that there was a lot of really like depressing setting up, like, you know, little like Excel spreadsheets and Word documents to like track the chronology of background events that were happening in the stories, and making sure that the way I ordered them in the collection like worked properly, you know, like made logistical sense. Like, is this character here? Is this character there? And like how many years have passed since this person saw this person there? All the like completely unexciting elements of like writing a short story collection that I totally didn't think I'd ever have to deal with. And then I did it, and it's completely onerous and boring. And but no, yeah, it's I'm really pleased with the way the stories were. That's like a big thanks to my editor, to be honest with you. That's the kind of thing where like an editor is a huge gift, because they can, you know, they have none of the sort of like emotional attachment to the placement of things that you do, and they can just like say pretty cleanly like, oh no, that should definitely be there, that should be there, that should be there. Otherwise I'd probably still be like reordering them now. Like wouldn't have had it in the manuscript. But yeah, no, great question.
Thank you. The next question I think is for both of you, but we'll start with Rebecca. There seems to be a thread of science fiction mixed in with very realist, very of this moment scenarios that runs through both of your collections. Would you consider them science fiction adjacent, or are we all just living in science fiction anyway?
Well, I think I guess there's one, the just total is the only story that's really like that for me. That's more set in a future that's not that different from our past, but that's, actually looking back on something that's also future that we haven't experienced yet, as Jem said. So I suppose it is kind of science fiction ish. I didn't think of it that way exactly. But I suppose it's the answer, but it certainly is also, as you said, are we all living in that kind of world? Yeah, I mean, it definitely mirrors our world. And it's just trying to kind of, it's a little bit more extreme in order to make our, to see our world more clearly, I guess. The situation is more extreme.
Yeah, and to your credit, like Total really doesn't feel, I don't know, the science fiction like kind of creeps in this very satisfying way. And like all the science fiction elements have a pretty, like a relatively mirror, something that does exist in reality, and like in a way, I don't know, like, yeah, because I'm as surprised as you to hear it called science fiction, which I guess it is, but like, yeah, that kind of creeps in the background. I don't know about mine. I'm trying to think, unless I could very well have like forgotten like there's like a spaceship in there or something. I don't think that there is, but I kind of get I get the question, like in terms of like trying to deal with like cutting edge technology, and there's it like borderline sentient technology, I guess, in a couple of the stories perhaps. And yeah, it's something I really like the idea of. I suppose like that just, yeah, that's a fact of like writing about technology in any way, and especially trying to be like super cutting edge with it, and write about things that are like incredibly present in the now. You end up with this feeling of sort of like yeah, something vaguely sci-fi. But I don't know, having said that, like I felt pretty well. Yeah, actually, that story about the dating app, I'll say here, when I originally started writing that, I was trying to do something where like I wanted it to be that like the algorithm did have some kind of like sentience in some kind of way. Like I wanted to explore that idea a little bit more, but I struggled with it. I couldn't make it work. I ended up, everything is kind of set in like base reality in this way. But yeah, like the recesses of like the human like depressive imagination kind of like give you all the like fantasy adjacent elements you could ever ask for, I suppose. But yeah, no, it's yeah.
Thank you. That's the audience questions we have, but we have a little bit of time left. So Jessie, if you have one last question you wanted to ask Rebecca and Jem, we could end with that.
Yeah, I have a capper question. Do you both have a favorite story in your own collection? One either that was your favorite to write, or just that you think is the best?
I can go while Rebecca thinks. I have this very short story called "Excuse Me, Don't I Know You." I had to look that up because it's a little while ago since I wrote it. And I don't know, it just fills in. That was the only story I wrote in the collection that came together very quickly. A lot of the other ones kind of took a long time, and they were percolating in the background, and I was taking notes and stuff. That story was the only one I wrote within like a couple of months, and it's still, I like it so much because to me it still has that feeling of like newness and weirdness and springiness, and like I don't fully understand where it came from or what it was doing. And I don't know, I think when I wrote that, I just had a lot of faith that it would work out. I was just kind of like putting the words down on I was going to say on paper, but on the digital equivalent of paper. And yeah, like that I for me that feels the most like someone else wrote it, that everything kind of came together in like this nice kind of coincidental way. And in fact, that's kind of what the story deals with as well, is like running into someone and having a nice coincidental chat with them. But yeah, I'd say that's my one, because it just kind of, it feels like a weird visitor in the collection to me. Like it not something I like labored on for so long, and it just kind of like sits there quite nicely in the middle of it.
Yeah, that's it. It's funny that you say that, because I feel like probably I would choose Total, the story Total, because it is an outlier and I've never written anything like it. I probably will never write anything like that again. I mean, I don't even know what happened. That it came in. I carried a little notebook around with me for a couple of years, and would just write down little sentences, and it just was like a sort of funny gift, even though it was dealing with a lot of the same stuff that a lot of the other stories were dealing with in terms of the human, the human dynamics. So I'm still puzzled by the story, and I guess that's yeah. So it's a very similar reason.
I love that. That it has such a fun shape as well. The story total, like it kind of starts, you kind of like think where it's going, and then the kind of like whole band element comes in, and it kind of takes this like left turn that goes like really deep. It really has that kind of like exciting feeling. Great.
We've reached the top of the hour. I just want to thank you all so much for joining us. Jem, thanks for staying up at all hours to be with us in the UK. Jessie, thanks for your moderation. Rebecca and Jem, thank you so much for reading your work and having this conversation. And thank